Wow. You see why the pharaohs chose this place.
Because I'm so excited.
It's an entrance. We can see an entrance.
After 3,000 years, a team of archaeologists finally opened the tomb of a forgotten pharaoh deep beneath the sands of Egypt.
It was absolutely a magnificent discovery. It made headline news all over the world and really sort of captured public imagination at just the right time.
At first, it looked like a typical royal burial, but things quickly took a horrifying turn. The team found something that should not have been there. And one by one, the experts who entered the inner chamber began to panic. Whatever was buried with this pharaoh was not meant to be disturbed. And now it's too late to undo it. So who exactly is this pharaoh? Here is how his shocking story began. The pharaoh who cheated death. Tutankhamun was never supposed to rule. He became pharaoh at just 9 years old, thrust into power after the collapse of his father Akhenaten's failed religious revolution, which had replaced Egypt's gods with a single sun deity and nearly destroyed the kingdom's spiritual foundation. And so, the young king's rule began in chaos. Egypt was falling apart and people were left confused and angry. What followed was a reign that hid something far more disturbing than history ever wanted to admit.
Are you ready to lead your people?
I am.
I think most people that know anything about King Tut know that he took the reign as a young boy. Imagine any kid now in 3rd grade suddenly told they're the ruler of an empire.
Tutankhamun didn't just fear death. He was consumed by it. He ordered projects that made no sense for a boy his age. He surrounded himself with symbols of divine power and eternal return. He commissioned magic spells and secret rituals meant for war in the next world. He commissioned spells pulled from the Book of the Dead and the older coffin texts, including those once used to bind the souls of enemies and trap demons in the afterlife. One ritual involved placing protective amulets over the heart and tongue to silence judgment. Another required the recitation of spell 151A, used to ward off spirits that devour the dead. These were not prayers. They were weapons. He believed something was coming for him, and he wanted to lock it out. The young pharaoh became obsessed with building a burial chamber that would never be found. He chose a location away from the great royal tombs, and he left clear instructions. He asked to be buried fast and to be well hidden. Tutankhamun ruled as a puppet in his early years, with powerful advisors making decisions in his name. But as he approached adulthood, he began asserting control. His orders grew strange and increasingly personal. He demanded edits to religious texts, inserting threats of punishment after death. He gave resources to priests who practiced burial rites that had not been used for generations. He introduced new rituals meant to defend the soul, not honor the gods. His behavior turned from reform to obsession. He feared betrayal in life. He feared judgment after death. And he acted like something was hunting him from both sides. Tutankhamun suffered from serious health problems. His bones were deformed, his immune system was weak, and he relied on a cane to walk. Some accounts suggest he could barely stand without help. DNA and CT scans show that these problems were made worse by inbreeding in the royal family. He had a club foot, fragile bones, a cleft palate, and scoliosis of the spine, all of which left him vulnerable to disease and injury. Still, he pushed forward. He poured vast resources into his burial, spending more than any pharaoh of his era. Then, without warning, he died. Some records blamed disease, while others suggested he may have been murdered. When researchers finally found his tomb and body, many confessed it was the most horrifying thing they had ever seen. What happened between his last breath and his burial has never been fully explained. But one thing is clear. He was hastily buried, as if someone wanted him gone. Tutankhamun himself didn't want to be remembered. And for 3,000 years it worked, because no one could find him. A tomb lost to time. After Tutankhamun's burial, his resting place was quickly swallowed by the desert and hidden beneath rubble left by later construction in the Valley of the Kings. According to Egyptologists, this concealment may not have been accidental. Some believe it was a deliberate effort to protect the tomb from looters who had already devastated many royal burials. Over centuries, shifting sands and collapsed structures erased all visible traces of the entrance. By the late periods of Egyptian history, no one in power seemed to remember exactly where the young pharaoh had been buried. This silence in the historical record only deepened the mystery. When outsiders began searching the Valley of the Kings in later centuries, rumors and legends grew around the forgotten tomb. Locals in nearby villages warned that misfortune would strike anyone who sought to disturb the Pharaoh of Shadows. Some told stories of men falling ill without explanation, equipment breaking in bizarre accidents, or diggers disappearing in the desert. These stories cannot be proven, but they spread among workers and explorers, feeding the idea that Tutankhamun's resting place carried a curse. By the 18th and 19th centuries, European treasure hunters and archaeologists arrived in Egypt, eager to uncover the secrets of the pharaohs. They dug across the valley with determination, certain that riches and glory waited beneath the sands. Yet despite their efforts, Tutankhamun's tomb remained hidden. A few diaries and letters from these expeditions mention strange illnesses and sudden deaths among the workers, though historians disagree on whether these were caused by disease, exhaustion, or something more sinister. The pattern was unsettling. Healthy men fell sick within days, some with fevers that doctors could not explain. Others collapsed on site with no warning. Even at the time, whispers spread that Tutankhamun's resting place carried a curse, and that those who sought to disturb it were paying the price. Despite this, archaeologists continued to search for the tomb, and all ended in vain. The repeated failures led many experts to question whether the tomb had ever survived at all. Some speculated it might have been robbed and destroyed in ancient times, leaving nothing to be found. Others suggested it could have been deliberately dismantled by rivals who wanted Tutankhamun's legacy erased. But what most dismissed as impossible was about to be challenged by a discovery that would change the world's understanding of ancient Egypt. Clues in the desert. By the early 20th century, advances in excavation techniques and more organized digging strategies reopened the possibility that something might still lie hidden beneath the desert surface. Howard Carter, a determined British archaeologist, was among the few who refused to accept the idea that Tutankhamun's tomb was lost. Funded by the wealthy Lord Carnarvon, he began a systematic search of the area in the early 1900s. While others moved on to new sites, Carter focused on overlooked patches of ground that had been dismissed as barren. Year after year, Carter and his workers sifted through rubble, cleared old excavation sites, and mapped the ground with painstaking care. Progress was slow and at times humiliating. Reports from the period note that some of his colleagues mocked his obsession with the valley, calling it a waste of time and money. Yet Carter was relentless. He collected fragments of pottery, small objects, and markings on walls that seemed insignificant to others, but hinted to him that a burial remained hidden. In time, his persistence revealed curious signs. Beneath dunes that had been ignored for decades, workers discovered what looked like blocked corridors and partially sealed entrances carved into the bedrock. These were not complete doorways, but fragments of passageways cut off by rockfalls or covered by centuries of debris. To Carter, they were unmistakable clues that something lay beyond. And so, he pressed forward toward the discovery that would shake the world. Opening the sealed tomb. In November 1922, after years of exhausting work, Howard Carter's team finally found what others had missed. Beneath rubble and forgotten huts in the Valley of the Kings, they uncovered a sealed stone doorway. The intact seal suggested that no one had entered for over 3 millennia. For Carter, this was the moment he had been chasing, the chance to step into history. When his workers chipped away at the ancient plaster and broke through the stone, a rush of stagnant air escaped. Those present later recalled how it carried a suffocating heaviness, as though the tomb itself exhaled after centuries of silence. The team braced themselves, unsure what they were about to face. Carter lit a candle and peered through the small opening. The chamber was packed to suffocation. Gold, ivory, and precious stones crowded every corner. Their sharp reflections in the lamplight created a harsh glare rather than beauty. The treasures were not laid out with reverence, but crammed together and piled on top of one another as if the burial had been rushed. Instead of wonder, the sight left Carter's team uneasy. It felt less like a king's eternal resting place and more like a storeroom. Several members later admitted feeling an unshakable sense of dread, as if they had crossed a threshold that was never meant for the living. The real shock would only come when the team ventured deeper inside. The Chamber of Horrors. When Carter's team stepped past the first sealed chamber, they expected a royal display of order and ceremony. What they saw instead felt wrong. The rooms were packed wall to wall with objects jammed together in disorganized piles. Boxes, coffins, weapons, and furniture were stacked on top of each other without care. Chariot parts leaned against painted shrines. Some pieces were broken or upside down. It looked like a rushed cleanup, not a king's resting place. This didn't match anything seen in other royal tombs. Normally, pharaohs were buried with their treasures laid out in a deliberate pattern, each item placed to help them reach the afterlife. Here, things were thrown in, as if the burial had to be done fast. It looked more like a panic than a plan. Carter and his team quickly became uneasy. Some jars were sealed tightly, but their shapes didn't match traditional embalming containers. Years later, chemical tests on their contents revealed strange results. Some held expected materials like animal fat and embalming resin, but others contained burned substances that didn't fit normal burial practices. A few even gave off signs of mixed organic remains, as if someone had burned bodies or parts of bodies and stored the ashes. Experts disagreed on what this meant. Some believed it was part of a ritual. Others feared it meant something had gone terribly wrong. Cloth and wooden boxes also showed clear burn marks, scorching on the edges, blackened spots, soot, signs of fire or smoke. Some believed these marks were left by funeral torches, but the damage was too widespread and uneven for that. Others argued it could be from a rushed ritual involving fire, or from an event that happened before the burial. The team could not explain why so many items seemed exposed to heat, and the uncertainty added to the pressure they felt. Carter wrote in his diary about the silence in those rooms. He said the air felt heavy, not like a place of peace, but like something hidden. He avoided guessing why the tomb looked this way, but his notes suggest he sensed something was wrong. Later, scholars would ask questions that he left unspoken. Was the tomb sealed in a rush after a crisis? Was Tutankhamun's death sudden, violent, or the result of a political disaster? None of these questions were answered by the clutter, but every broken box and scorched fragment made one thing clear. This was not a normal royal burial. Something had disrupted the process. Something had caused panic. As Carter's team cleared more space, the fear grew. And then, at the heart of it all, they found what no one was prepared for: the body itself. What they saw inside the coffin changed everything. The Pharaoh's disturbing mummy. Howard Carter and his team believed they were about to uncover a carefully preserved royal body, one wrapped with order and reverence. Instead, what they found horrified them. Tutankhamun's mummy was unlike anything seen in other royal tombs. His remains were so damaged, so disfigured, that even seasoned archaeologists struggled to make sense of what lay before them. The most obvious shock was the destruction of his chest. The heart, sternum, ribs, and much of the front cavity were missing entirely. This discovery disturbed Egyptologists more than almost anything else. In Egyptian belief, the heart was the core of identity and morality. It was the organ weighed in the Hall of Judgment against the feather of Ma'at. The feather, an ostrich plume sacred to the goddess of truth and order, was the standard of justice in the afterlife. If the heart was as light as the feather, the soul was granted eternal life. If it was heavier, burdened by wrongdoing, the soul was destroyed forever. Without a heart, Tutankhamun could not even take part in this test. To the ancient Egyptians, it meant his afterlife had been deliberately stolen from him. Besides this, Tutankhamun's bones were brittle, archened, and, in many places, charred. This suggested exposure to heat intense enough to carbonize human tissue. Modern chemical studies later revealed that the resin poured over Tutankhamun during embalming likely reacted violently with oxygen inside the sealed coffin. Combined with a rush of heat, this caused a fire-like reaction that burned the body from within. The evidence matched Carter's own observations. He had written that the linens were hardened, fused to the blackened bones, and could not be removed without snapping them apart. It was not the image of honor in death. It was closer to cremation than to traditional mummification. The horror deepened when researchers in the 1960s and 1970s re-examined the remains. X-rays and physical inspections confirmed the strange destruction. The body seemed not only burned, but also handled in unusual ways. The absence of his heart, ribs, and sternum was not consistent with fire alone. It raised the possibility that the body had been deliberately altered, perhaps cut apart before or during embalming. Some argued this was done hastily, in a rush to bury the boy king after an unexpected death. Others feared it pointed to something done deliberately. Forensic CT scans in the early 2000s revealed even more troubling details. Tutankhamun's skull showed damage at the back. Some specialists argued this was caused by rough handling after death, perhaps during Carter's unwrapping, while others warned that a deliberate blow could not be ruled out. But the most decisive finding came from his left leg. Scans showed a catastrophic fracture just above the knee. The break was sharp and irregular, consistent with a violent accident, not a clean surgical cut. Tissue analysis indicated the wound had been open when he died, and signs of infection were present. Tutankhamun was already physically fragile, relying on canes because of congenital deformities in his feet and spine. This made him especially vulnerable. The CT evidence suggested that shortly before death, he suffered a fall or crash that shattered his leg. If infection set in, his weakened body might not have been able to survive it. This finding reignited one of the central debates about his death. Did Tutankhamun die from an accident worsened by his frailty, or was he deliberately struck down? The leg fracture pointed toward a sudden accident, perhaps from a fall or a chariot crash. But this theory did not explain the other horrors: the missing heart and ribs, the scorched chest cavity, and the unnatural burning of his body. Even if the leg injury caused his death, why was his embalming process so brutal, leaving him charred and incomplete? The contradiction has haunted Egyptologists ever since. Another disturbing possibility is that embalmers themselves destroyed the body, either through error or by following unusual rites. Yet, this explanation does little to comfort. It suggests that the most famous burial in history was carried out with negligence and desperation, leaving the king disfigured forever. And yet, as horrifying as the mummy itself was, the walls carried words and images that added an even more unsettling layer to the story. Forbidden inscriptions. When Carter's team cleared away the debris and entered the painted chambers of Tutankhamun's tomb, they expected to find the usual religious texts that guided a pharaoh into the afterlife. And in many ways, they did. The walls contained long passages from the Amduat and the Book of the Dead, collections of spells and rituals meant to help the dead king survive the dangers of the underworld and reach eternal life. But something about these texts was different. Scholars quickly noticed that many of the scenes focused heavily on violent battles against chaos. The serpent Apophis, a monster that represented disorder, was shown again and again being hacked, cut apart, and burned by the gods. This was not unusual in Egyptian belief, but in Tutankhamun's tomb, the violence dominated the walls. The tone was darker, more aggressive, and far less peaceful than what other royal tombs displayed. By the mid-20th century, some researchers even described these as forbidden spells. That was an exaggeration, but it reflected how unsettling the images were. The repetition of destruction and punishment did not look like calm guidance into the afterlife. It looked like a warning. To many, it suggested that Tutankhamun's passage into the next world was not going to be smooth, but filled with fear, struggle, and enemies that had to be fought at every step. Other experts believe the sheer number of violent scenes suggests the priests who buried Tut thought his soul needed extra protection. They may have believed Tutankhamun was cursed or vulnerable and required stronger, harsher rituals than normal. In that reading, the inscriptions were not just guidance. They were shields, barriers, and possibly warnings meant to keep away intruders. The effect on Carter's team was immediate. Surrounded by walls showing gods burning and tearing apart monsters, they felt more dread than awe. Locals who already feared the so-called curse of the pharaohs took the violent scenes as proof. To them, these were not blessings for a safe journey, but threats aimed at anyone daring to disturb the king's rest. The implications are terrifying. If the images were protective, then those who buried Tutankhamun feared his afterlife would not be normal. If they were warnings, then the tomb itself was designed as a trap, meant to keep the living out. Either way, the inscriptions show that Tutankhamun's death and burial were treated as dangerous, even unstable. He was not sent peacefully into the next world. He was sent into battle. Condemned to be forgotten. Tutankhamun's tomb has always puzzled archaeologists for one reason above all others. It is far too small for a king of Egypt. Other pharaohs were buried in vast complexes of corridors and chambers, yet Tut was sealed away in a modest set of rooms more suited for a noble or official. The narrow corridors and cramped spaces suggested that his death came suddenly, and that there was little time to prepare a proper royal tomb. The objects inside deepened the strangeness. Some of the artifacts bore traces that they had not been made for Tutankhamun at all. Close study revealed names and titles of other royals carved beneath his own. Furniture, jewelry, and even parts of the burial equipment had been repurposed. Egyptologists concluded that items originally prepared for someone else were hastily altered and given to Tut. To rob a pharaoh of treasures made specifically for his reign was shocking. It implied not only haste, but a lack of respect, as though his burial was a problem to be solved quickly, rather than an honor to be carried out with care. Why was he treated this way? Tutankhamun ruled at a time of deep turmoil. His father, Akhenaten, had overturned Egypt's religion by forcing worship of a single god, the Aten. When Akhenaten died, Tut and his advisors tried to restore the old order, but resentment lingered. To some, Tutankhamun was tied to a hated dynasty that had caused chaos. His early death at about 19 left him without the military victories or monumental projects that usually secured a king's legacy. His successors may have seen more value in erasing him than in celebrating him. The inscriptions on his tomb only deepened the confusion. They were filled with violent protective spells and images of gods battling chaos. This suggested that priests carried out some form of ritual preparation for the afterlife. Yet the rushed tomb, reused objects, and missing heart point to contempt and neglect. The contradiction shows division among those who handled his death. Some followed tradition by inscribing protective texts, while others stripped him of dignity and burial and later erased his name. In the end, Tutankhamun's body was placed in a tomb that seemed half meant to protect him and half meant to dishonor him. The final insult came after the burial itself. Tutankhamun's name was struck from the official king lists of Egypt. In the eyes of later rulers, he was not to be remembered as a legitimate pharaoh. To erase a king's name was to deny him eternity, the worst fate in Egyptian belief. Combined with his missing heart and the strange, cramped burial, it created the impression of a ruler deliberately condemned by those who came after him. And yet, despite every attempt to minimize and erase him, the discovery of his tomb reversed that fate. The young king, who was given no grand monument, who was sealed in a makeshift chamber with borrowed treasures, became the most famous pharaoh in the world. His body may have been broken, and his memory deliberately attacked. But the opening of his tomb in 1922 made him eternal in a different way. The irony is crushing. What his successors tried to erase has instead become the image that defines ancient Egypt itself. Not glory, but tragedy, preserved in stone and bone. What do you think about these discoveries? Comment down below.